Ni hao, all my beautiful individuals out there. In this video I'm going to be burning another flag. This is going to be, I think, the 7th flag in this series. I've been burning several flags, and let's just go ahead and get into it. So in today's video, we're going to be burning a pretty fun flag. We're going to ruffle some feathers. We've burned the official communist flag, but in this video we'll be burning the Chinese communist flag. Now, when we burned the communist flag before, that was the de facto flag for the ideology of communism, which was a national flag of a former country, the Soviet Union. This, however, is not a de facto flag. It is not a symbolic flag. It is the active current national flag of the country that we call China. Now, the nation itself is not simply called China. The nation itself is called the People's Republic of China. We'll get a little bit back to that after a while. What you need to know about this flag is it's not only the flag of a country, but it is a flag that was created, that was implemented under the direction of a man by the name of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong took power back in 1949, and he was the leader, the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. So, indirectly, this is not just the flag of the country, but it's the flag of that political party. Now, to cover a bit of history, the area in Asia that we call China, this territory, has been populated for thousands of years, essentially under this same culture that we today know of as China. And in those thousands of years, the country has been broken apart and reassembled and broken apart and reassembled more times than probably some of the best historians can keep track of. But one thing that you must keep in mind that has stayed true the entire time is that over all of those thousands of years, the Chinese people have always lived under a monarchy. These monarchs, these dynasties, are supreme ruling families, basically like kings and queens. They were emperors and empresses. Now, this is the historical tradition for their people. Like I said, spanning thousands of years. But it all changed just in the last century. Just back in the 20th century, it all changed for the first time in 1912. You see, there once was a man who, from my understanding, what I can figure out, his name was Sun Yat-sen. We'll just call him Mr. Sun. Mr. Sun actually left China, mainland China, and lived in Honolulu before Hawaii was ever brought into the United States of America. And while he was living there, he got to study what is considered Western culture or Western civilization. He got to learn about the current, at the time, history of America and its founding, as well as studying British history. He got to study English, the language, and he also became a Christian. Mr. Sun actually kind of idolized Abraham Lincoln. He thought Abraham Lincoln was had a beautiful mind, had a beautiful vision for how to lead a country. He took heavy influence from it. And later in Mr. Sun's career, his political career, he even quoted, a translation of, but he quoted Abraham Lincoln's quotes. After many years passed, Mr. Sun actually was able to return to China, where he spearheaded a political revolution. This revolution was specifically aimed at the monarchical system that had enslaved the Chinese people for thousands of years. Now, Mr. Sun did all of this because he was becoming a nationalist. Mr. Sun believed in China. He believed in the Chinese people. But he did not believe in some divine authority of a monarchy. Mr. Sun believed that China had a right as a sovereign nation to control what's going on within its borders, and that other countries should not be affecting what's going on in China. And furthermore, he believed that China shouldn't be worried about what's going on in other countries, that it's their problems. But more importantly, Mr. Sun was opposed to the monarchy because after studying Western culture, he became a Republican. Now, I say Republican, I mean that in the truest definition. I don't mean that he was associated with the American political party known as the Republican Party. Mr. Sun began to believe in the idea of a republic, a constitutional republic. He began to believe in the democratic process of electing representatives to speak on behalf of the people, that they were put there by the people to create a government for the people, made of the people. After studying Western culture and how the West is so obsessed with individual liberties, that he began to believe in individual liberties. He believed that the Chinese people were being deprived of their human rights and their human liberties. Mr. Sun believed that China deserved a constitution and that there should be elected officials put in power to ensure that individuals had human rights, individual human rights. The problem was he was essentially selling something that the Chinese people didn't understand. In his speeches, Mr. Sun even acknowledged that in his language, in China at that time, there was no word that was a good representation, a good translation of the English word liberty. It was so, the culture of China at the time was so devoid of the concept of liberty, there wasn't even a word for it. So how could he be a salesman for something they don't even have a word for? Liberty was an alien thing to these people who had lived under the chains of a monarchy for thousands of years. But it sounded really good. It was weird. It was a wild concept. It was a foreign concept to the people of the Far East. But Mr. Sun was a good salesman. And he started to win over the hearts and minds of the people of China. Mr. Sun and his followers wanted a change in China. And while he was, walking around his suit and tie, doing his political revolution, holding rallies and giving speeches, he eventually got that change. because while he was doing the more civil things, there were others, revolutionaries, more violent ones, that were fighting. They were on the ground, away from the rallies that he was holding. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting against the armies of the monarchy. These nationalist revolutionaries forced an abdication of the throne. The irony is, most people think that nationalism is a right-wing ideology, and then other people who try to understand how there's a left versus right, these people try to say that monarchy is right-wing. And so in this situation, is it right-wing rebelling against right-wing? How do you wrap your mind around that? How do you wrap your mind around this concept with the current left versus right paradigm that nationalists were rebelling against a monarchy? If my school of thought resonates with you, if what I teach sounds true to you, then you would think that nationalism is actually just the center between the left and the right, and that monarchism is actually an external ideology. It's outside of the left and right. That monarchism is beyond the extreme left and it's beyond the extreme right. And so, in my beliefs, this wasn't a battle simply between nationalists and monarchists. It was a battle between what I identify as the top versus the bottom. Because I believe there is a left and a right, but there's also a top and a bottom. In 1912, the world saw the birth of a new nation, the Republic of China. Just like the first president of the United States of America, George Washington, Mr. Sun, who became the first president of China, didn't want the power. Just like how George Washington was kind of talked into staying in power, but eventually just walked away and he's like, I'm done. Y'all got to figure it out yourself. Mr. Sun, immediately upon obtaining presidency, resigned. He's like, I don't want this. Unfortunately, things kind of fell apart after that. Everybody started infighting and wanting power. But he did his duty. In 1912, China had a sense of freedom for the first time in thousands of years. And the young nationalist revolutionaries celebrated their victory because they fought hard, they earned it. Unfortunately, there was one guy by the name of Mao Zedong who fought in that war. He fought as a nationalist revolutionary and he ended up revolting against his fellow revolutionaries. He revolted against the old to establish a new, and then he revolted against that too. It's like these people are never happy. In his youth, Mao began to read translated literature from the Soviet Union, and, well, it resonated with him. He began to embrace communism. Now, Mao wasn't very smart, but at least he had the common sense enough to surround himself with people who were even smarter than him. And these smarter people, they were able to actually read untranslated stuff. They were able to read the actual writings of Karl Marx himself, as well as untranslated pieces of literature from Vladimir Lenin. And Mao began to surround himself with many young communists. These young communists began to burn with an anger, a hatred of the nationalists who had gotten into power and who had won the revolution in 1911. Despite Mao Zedong being a nationalist revolutionary, he eventually became a communist revolutionary. And surrounding himself with these fellow communists, they all claimed to hate nationalism. They thought communism was something better than nationalism. This is rather ironic because communism is all about workers of the world unite. Drop the national borders. Let us all be unified as peoples of the earth. And yet, when the Soviet Union was advocating for China to cease to exist as a sovereign nation, Mao Zedong rejected this idea. Mao Zedong thought it would be best if China stopped mirroring the outside world and began to take some pride in who they were and to do their own thing, to strengthen their own national sovereignty with communism. I feel like I've talked about this kind of thing in this exact spot, probably from a very similar position before. It's almost like anytime someone takes the teachings of Karl Marx, no matter how they try to spin it, when they put it into effect, it always turns into bloated government authoritarianism. It's weird how anytime someone implements the policies, the teachings of Karl Marx, it just some reason always turns into a giant power grab of people being forced to submit and worship the state, and it leading to mass death and suffering. I'm gonna step off to the side there, get my shoes clean real quick, let you look at this flag a little bit while I finish up what I have to say. Mao Zedong was not only short, fat, balding, and ugly. Mao not only had his teeth rotting out of his head and infamously rarely bathed, causing him to have a foul odor, as well as, having head and body lice, which resulted in him scratching himself in public to the point of getting sores, kind of like a nasty meth head. Mao not only had no shame about digging in his crotch and anus and nose and ears in public, Mao Zedong also oversaw the deaths of more people than any other person in known human history. Mao's communist revolution defeated those evil nationalists in 1949 and restored the Chinese people to their ancestral home under the boot of a dictator. Or, in Mao's case, probably a dirty bare foot with long yellow toenails. The name of the nation was altered, and the flag of the nation was changed from the Republic of China flag to this one, the People's Republic of China. And it was done so under the force, the authority of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. After taking power, the regime that was built upon the teachings of Karl Marx, did what all regimes built upon the teachings of Karl Marx do: mass murder. But it wasn't just mass murder. There's always some other goodies that go along with authoritarianism. Like mass spying, that's always fun. Of course, there was a cult of personality for Mao, built by a propaganda machine of fake news, building up a big lie that he was some grand being. People worshipped him, literally. They prayed to him. Of course, there was a whole political indoctrination, phase where people were just being told that he was so great and, that there's no reason to question his authority and his wisdom. What am I missing? Oh yeah, concentration camps. Oh, well, they didn't call them concentration camps. They called them gulags. Oh no, wait. Gulags, that's a Soviet thing. What? The Chinese, they just called them labor camps. That's right. So in China, they were called labor camps. Yeah, so they rounded people up and they put them in the labor camps. But how? How did they round people up? If people don't want to go, you'd think they would want to fight back. Well, you see, Mao, he famously said that, and this is a translation, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So the Communist Party must have all the guns. Oh, well, that makes sense. He just used his power controlling the government as the dictator to, round up all the firearms. No need to have all these civilians running around with firearms. They might, revolt. For some reason, Mao had some extensive history with this, and he had seen how revolutions have effects that result in people such as himself losing power. And for some reason, he revolted once and he wasn't happy, and then he revolted a second time and he got all this power and he was finally happy. It's almost like all he cared about was getting power. But what you must understand is Mao didn't just want power, okay? He had a vision. Okay? He had a dream. He had a utopian dream for his people. His people. And his country. This vision involved people owning no guns, as well as, no private property. In fact, people were forced to give up all of their possessions. And then were relocated to labor farms or to labor camps. You see, Mao's people, his people, they would get whatever he gave them. And they would be thankful for it. Because he was kind. He cared about the people. This is the part of the story where Mao began to put his vision into action. He wanted a great leap forward for the Chinese people. It was going to be his leap forward. He was going to be the architect. He was going to be the author. He was going to be the one controlling all of this. So then after all this joy, after all this prosperity, after this utopia was created, everybody would know it was him. Because he was just that good. He was so impressive. So, Mao, being the student of Karl Marx that he was, seized all of the private property and crops of the people so that the state controlled everything, controlled the distribution of food. The people had nothing. The individuals had nothing, but the collective, which was symbolized by the state and united together by the party, had everything. The collective had everything. They shared everything. It was a communeship, if you will. And Mao was, the face or figurehead or voice of that collective. Man, this is really, I'm having like deja vu. I feel like I've said these similar things about, like, I don't know, Soviet Union, or maybe it was Nazi Germany, or was it Fascist Italy? I can't remember. For some reason, it's all kind of blurring together here. It's almost like they're all the fucking same. Well, the happy workers, once they were relocated to the labor camps, they got to work for Chairman Mao, and they started making sure the crops were doing good, making sure they had good harvest. But the thing you have to keep in mind is workers weren't given food unless they did their jobs for the day or harvested the required quota for the day. And what you have to understand is these workers that I'm speaking of, if you were a human being in China at this time, that makes you a worker. Period. So, let's pause real quick, time out. Let's analyze this. Any human being is a worker. And workers don't get food unless they reach the quota of the day in regards to how much food they're harvesting or how much work they're putting in. What do you think happened then? Well, the old people weren't reaching their quotas, and the children weren't reaching their quotas, and the handicapped weren't reaching their quotas. The young, the healthy, agile people like my age, oh, they were doing good. They had the strength. And so, they got food. Because, hey, they put in a fair day's work, so of course they got a fair day's share of food. But all those useless eaters, those old people, those little children, those handicapped people that can't work because they ain't got an arm or whatever bullshit excuse they want to come up with, they didn't get paid. They didn't get food. They just had to hope that they got better luck tomorrow. Because if they didn't, well, they wasn't going to have dinner tomorrow either. As you can imagine, this lack of food led to people getting weaker and slower. And this led to them less likely to reach their quota, which meant it was more common for them to not get food, which in turn made them weaker and slower, making it even more likely that they would not reach their quota until they died. Millions of people were starved to death at these labor camps under this flag. This flag rounded people up, put them in labor camps or labor farms, and worked/starved them to death by the millions. But this is totally different from the Nazis. Yeah, totally different. Well, as fun as it was for, the old people and the handicapped and the children who were starving to death, the people who were young and healthy, they soon realized they weren't having as much help around them. It started out like one guy's working and he's got like two old people beside him. And then a week or two later, it's just the one guy and the two old people are dead and gone. And now all of a sudden, the higher ups are coming by looking at the young guy like, why aren't you doing more work? Look at all the field that's not getting tended to. You should be doing that. And so the younger people started getting overworked because they were having to pick up the slack. They were being forced to do this labor that was more labor than they could physically do. Thus, the bar for how much the quota was per day,
it got higher. And so they started starving to death too. Wow. It's very unfortunate. Really unfortunate, specifically for the people in the cities. Because there still were some people living in cities. And the city folk, they were not getting the crops that they needed to survive. It's almost like the labor force that was supposed to be picking the crops were being starved to death. Huh. They had a job collecting food and died of starvation. Something was amiss. Something's wrong. And luckily, Mao Zedong, the guy who brought the world this flag, in his infinite wisdom, he knew what the problem was. And it wasn't him. It was not him. It was not the Chinese Communist Party. It wasn't any policies that he had put into play. No, he knew the problem was actually the birds. Yeah. You see, the birds, Mao Zedong enlightened everybody, was eating the produce, was eating the crops, eating the rice. And he figured, hey, you know, if we could just start killing off all the birds, well then the crops, the rice wouldn't be being eaten by the birds, and thus that's more food for the people. So he made a decree, the elected ruler of this republic, he made a decree that all the sparrows had to go for the greater good. So the people, getting their new marching orders, began to mass kill the sparrows. Anytime they saw a bird land, they would run up to it and scare it and yell at it and bang pots. They did everything they could to make sure the birds stayed in the air. And it's kind of like forcing someone to run until their heart stops. Since the birds could not land and catch their breath, they beat their hearts to death and were just dropping from the air, dying. And if they landed and they're all exhausted and they couldn't fly anymore, any person that caught them would kill them. So they began this mass euthanizing, this extermination policy to kill off the sparrows. And yeah, it didn't bring the salvation they thought it would. It didn't fix the problem at all. Because you see, weird thing about birds, they eat bugs. Especially the kinds that eat crops. So, as a result of killing off all the main predators, these sparrows, the bugs began to grow like crazy. And oh gosh, it didn't work out. This massive blight swept across the crops, across the rural areas of China, and a great famine kicked into play. It was so bad that, well, drastic choices had to be made. Have any of you ever heard of the fictional character named Thanos? If there ever was a real-life influence for that fictional character, it would be Mao Zedong. During the Great Leap Forward was possibly the greatest example, the purest example of true Machiavellian thinking. Because of this famine that Mao Zedong and his policies caused, the people of China began to starve. And Mao made a choice for the greater good, in his opinion. He came to the conclusion that it was best if half of the country starved to death, while the other half were able to continue to eat their full, to get full meals each day, instead of everybody dividing up the food equally and everyone being inconvenienced. Mao Zedong decided to abandon rural China, the people out in the country. He decided to take their food and to ship it all, by the government dime, by the government arm, ship it all into the heavily populated cities. So it's kind of like he looked at a big map of the country, and he looked at all this area out here, and he thought, well, land doesn't vote. That area isn't important. Let's just take their food and we'll give it to this small area over here with a dense population. After all, it's better if this big swath of land with few people on it get a little angry than this tiny area where there's a whole lot of people and they can all rally together and make a lot of noise together collectively and revolt. At first, you might assume that these communists thought everybody was equal, that everybody was the same. But in practice, that wasn't the case. The urban people had a superiority complex. They thought they were better than the rural folk, and the rural folk were left to starve to death. Now you might think, well, if they were out in the country, country folk, why couldn't they take care of themselves? Well, because the government took over everything. Because they were all rounded up and put on these labor farms. Because they weren't allowed to grow anything, because anything that is produced is controlled by the state, controlled by the collective. You don't have anything. You don't have guns to hunt. You don't have a house to even live in. Literally, the government has given you what you need. And if you don't have food, well, I guess you didn't need it. Communists. Yeah, the Great Leap Forward lasted for 4 years. And in that 4-year span, the best estimates suggest that 45 million Chinese people were starved to death by their own government. This government, by Mao Zedong. Best estimates. The government that flew this flag in the past, and still does today, starved nearly 4 times as many people to death as the Nazis did. After the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong decided to create the Red Guard. And what was the Red Guard? Well, the Red Guard was essentially a generation of young people who were indoctrinated in public schooling, in state-run educational systems. They were brought up with endless propaganda, educated to think and believe in one way, to see the world in one way. They were told what to think, and they were told how to think. These young people were taught to hate the elderly. They were taught to hate the older generations, and specifically told to hate the old ways of thinking. You see, they were told to get rid of the old ways of thinking, these ways that were tied back to nationalism, these more traditional ways of thinking. And instead, these young people believed that it was best to exchange that old way for a new way of thinking. Yes, and by new, I mean the right way of thinking. Because to think anything else is wrong. You can't think anything else. Thinking other things is bad. You have to think the new thing, which is the right thing, which is the thing the government says to think. The thing that Mao says you must think. They were emboldened by the belief that the youth was the future. So the youth's opinion, or votes, and I'm using that sarcastically, must dictate the present. Because, after all, the future is built today, in the present. These radicalized youth brigades were quite literally civilian soldiers. They were warriors who fought a cultural revolution in the streets of their country against their own citizens. And they did this Because instead of seeing them as fellow citizens, they were seen as the enemy. All sources of literally, quote, Western culture. That's the translation of what they were saying. They were trying to weed out Western culture. Okay? So, all sources of Western culture were eradicated. We're talking books, music, art, fashion, and even people. Yeah, any person who promoted these ways of thinking had to be destroyed, had to go. It was a wave of terror, violence, vandalism. Any free thinkers were canceled. Submit to the cult, wave their flags, and shout their chants. Or you will be beaten by the mob, and any businesses that you were allowed to work in, well, they're all going to be destroyed. And your family is going to also suffer too. Because if they're putting up with you, they must be bad too. The people in the cities, well, they were allowed to keep some forms of property. They didn't get rounded up and yanked out of their homes. They didn't get sent to the labor farms. Unfortunately, these Red Guards, these young youth brigades, they went to people's homes. They went to schools. They went to places of worship and businesses. They went wherever you went. You could not escape them. Nowhere was safe. And the government allowed the Red Guard mobs to purge the portion of the population which was seen as traitors. Of course, there were law enforcement walking around, but, police, they just happened to always not be looking when the Red Guard showed up. Yeah, see, they were essentially given stand-down orders. If the mobs didn't kill their victims, well, they were arrested by the police for the crimes of being victims to those who were the arbiters of what is socially acceptable. If you just didn't do what was wrong, if you just were politically correct, the mob wouldn't have kicked your ass. They wouldn't have tried to kill you. This is your fault you got hurt. What were you thinking? And of course, those who were arrested were sent to labor camps, to rehabilitate them. You must understand the chaos that these Red Guards were creating. It wasn't because they were anti-law or because they were anti-government. It was merely the fog of war. Once the culture war was over and their political opponents all lied dead in mass graves somewhere, and the elements of the evil old ways destroyed, then the everlasting, peaceful, collectivist utopia could begin under the guidance of the all-knowing, all-powerful state, the Communist Chinese Party. They're going to take care of you, while claiming to seek the unification of the nation. Of course, to progress forward, in a great leap forward, Mao and his legions of brainwashed lemmings tore China apart. By the time Mao Zedong had died, his Chinese Communist Party murdered between 50 and 70 million people. The Nazis killed 12 million. The highest estimates of the Soviets was 45 million. Mao Zedong, under this flag, killed approximately between 50 and 70 million people. So at minimum, at least 4 times that of the Nazis. At maximum, we're talking almost 6 times that of the Nazis. And yet, instead of this flag being the image of all that is evil in the world, for some reason people just fixate on the swastika. I mean, I get it, you know, Nazis are stupid, and Nazis were evil, and they had a horrible way of governance. They made a lot of stupid decisions. They were racist, not good people. But as I look at this flag and its history, I just gotta ask, couldn't we direct that hate at something more worthy? Here's the scariest part about it all, okay? The Nazis, they're dead and gone. That regime is over. And so, even though they destroyed records, we have a good idea of what they did and how many people they killed. The same is with the Soviets. They're dead and gone, and though they did destroy a lot of records, we've been able to look through stuff and get a good idea of what's going on, or at least what happened. Yeah, and that's not the case for this. The Nazis, dead and gone. The Soviets of Russia, dead and gone. The communist Chinese, this is still here, people. All of the stuff I've said, that's not just a thing of the past. They're still in power. Mao Zedong is dead, but his successors to his party, under his flag, still hold power in China today. And since they're still in power, we don't know what the true extent of how many people they killed under Mao. How many people have they killed since? We're talking decades that this has been still in power after Mao. Only God himself knows how many people have been murdered under this flag. Some people like to bash America and say, America's got the highest prison population in the world. Not even communist China's got that many. You know why? Because they murder everybody. They have a lower prison population because they murder their inmates. They put them all to death. Here's something to think about. China, not decades ago, not even a couple years ago, right now, as I'm speaking, the communist Chinese have what are called mobile execution vans. What is a mobile execution van? I'll tell you. A mobile execution van is a van that they put a prisoner into, and they transport that prisoner to an airport where a plane is waiting. On the way to the airport, to the tarmac, they cut open the inmate while they're alive, and they harvest the organs from this human being. They steal the organs, the insides, from this living, breathing human being, so that they are the purest, freshest organs that money can buy. Harvested right there on the way to the plane, so that when they get there, they can give the human body parts, the organs stolen from a person, to an international buyer. That's why they have a low prison population. That's what goes on under this flag. Just one thing. Are you aware that despite the horror, and it was horrible, despite the horror that was the concentration camps during the Holocaust, and despite how horrible the gulags were by the Soviets, do you realize the communist Chinese still have concentration camps right now as I'm speaking to you. Do you realize that they have their labor camps right now? And we don't know how many people are being killed in there. We don't know how many people they're holding in there. We know they exist. How many people have they massacred over the decades? They round people up who are Christian, who are Muslim, who are Jews. They round up people who disagree with the Communist Party or who insult their leader. They have a social credit score system, and they punish people off the most pettiest of shit. Something as simple as buying too much junk food can result in your life being ruined by the government. They have slave labor sweatshops, slave factories in China, where things that you and I, things that we buy are built using slave labor by people who are forced in there to do labor they don't want to do. These international corporations have their products built over there by them, and then they sell it to us, and then they shame us for being capitalists and materialistic. Their slave factories have suicide nets built around them, so that their slaves, they're not laborers, they're slaves. When the slaves are tired of being slaves and they would rather choose death, and they try to jump out of these buildings and out of these windows to kill themselves, they have suicide nets to catch them so that they can apprehend them and punish them or put them back to work. Because, God forbid, the Communist Chinese lose essential slaves. This is going on right now in our day and age. Where's the outcry? Everybody is fucking terrified of the Communist Chinese. No one will speak out. All the famous athletes and movie stars, they kiss the boots of the Chinese. No one will dare talk out against them. Furthermore, just like the Soviets and just like the Nazis, they are becoming aggressive and expansive. They are militaristically pushing up against the borders of Mongolia and India. Even engaging in shootouts with India on the border. They are aggressively pushing further out to sea, encroaching upon the waters rightfully controlled by Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, and even against South Korea. The Communist Chinese do not respect the individual sovereignty of the people of Tibet. The Communist Chinese do not respect the city-state sovereignty of the city of Hong Kong. The Communist Chinese do not respect the national sovereignty of the nation of Taiwan. The Communist Chinese were seeing their nation's economy crumbling back in 2019. And then their commie cold, if you will, was unleashed upon the world. And while everyone went into a year-long lockdown recession, the Chinese stayed open for business and made up some economic ground. While we suffered, hey, they were doing okay. The truth is, as horrible as what Germany and Japan did during the Second World War, their combined efforts didn't have the effect China has had with their commie cold. China has single-handedly harmed every nation on planet Earth. They have single-handedly killed citizens in every nation on Earth in the last 1 year. Just 1 year. They have attacked the entire planet. They have harmed the entire planet. I'm not even talking about the climate change stuff. I don't care about it, but I know a lot of people think that CO2 is super bad and all this. Look, there are things worse than CO2 that come out of plants. And China doesn't clean any of it up. They are putting out way more pollution than any other country. They put out more pollution than the whole West, US, Australia, and all of Europe combined. Where are all the environmentalists to speak up on this? Where are all these leftists who want to conserve the earth? Where are all the conservatives who want to come out and talk about, you know, saving the climate and saving the oceans and saving the forests and all this shit? Where are they to speak up on this? These people have murdered an unknown number of millions of people, and they are still in power. They have nuclear bombs. Possibly even the most scariest thing is these people are landing drones on Mars, potentially playing a role in laying the foundation of a future civilization on another planet. Do we really want them to be adding cornerstones to the foundation of a whole new planet civilization? The idea that their government is on the UN's Human Rights Council is the most insane spit in the face imaginable. The current Chinese government is the greatest threat to humanity. Their people are suffering violations of human rights and human liberties daily. The Chinese Communist Party is rapidly moving towards starting a third world war in their efforts to establish a communist empire. And so, I'm going to burn this flag. And I'm going to do it as a way of saying, fuck the Communist Chinese Party and free the common Chinese people.